Welcome to the 12th. I always forget what number we're on, Gary. 12th edition of the lockdown discussions, and it's mid-June. I thought we had been out by now, but here we are. We haven't seen each other for 3 months, I think.
Not in the flesh, no.
No, quite something. We haven't sat next to each other at a desk or in a meeting room or anything, which is fine, but also a bit weird.
It is unusual, isn't it? But I wouldn't want to be out today. It's mid-June, but it's miserable. Absolutely
miserable, yeah.
Weather today. So perfect day to be doing another episode.
It's always a perfect day for another episode. And today we're going to talk about what we term the ecosystem, the publishing, the auxiliary. Well, I guess let's call the moons around the planet of publishing, the things that orbit the production of books. I think is probably a good way of putting it. But before we get onto that, we'll do our usual. What have you been reading, gag? And Gary, what have you been reading?
This week I've been reading. Well, I'm still reading because it's been a bit slow this week for some reason. I'm still reading Errantry by Liz Hand. Absolutely fantastic novel of short story. Not a novel of short stories. What am I talking about? A collection of short stories. The story in it is Near Zenor. I mentioned. Absolutely brilliant. But I've been listening to an audiobook this week as well. I've only recently kind of got into audiobooks. I think I was quite resistant to the idea for some, I don't know. I don't really know why. It hadn't occurred to me it was something that I could do. Does that make sense?
That you could listen to them?
Yeah, I thought, oh no, that's for, the younger people. Anyway, I'd wanted to read the book Natives by Akala for a while. And I thought, well, non-fiction has sort of been working better for me in audio form.
Yeah.
And I was correct. So really great book. I'm sure lots of people watching this have read that, I'm sure, or are aware of it. But just a really interesting kind of mixture of, I suppose, of memoir, kind of like memoir, autobiography, but very much focusing on race and class in what's the subtitle of the book? In the Ruins of Empire.
Yeah.
So very, very kind of British imperial focus on those two things, race and class, and all the intersections of those. A lot of the historical stuff it goes into. Some of it I knew, some of it I didn't. So that's quite pleasant, sort of adding to my history of the appalling things done by the British Empire. So that's maybe a good thing. And I don't know, I think I'm about halfway through it at the moment. What I do like about it is that he's not going into this. You read a lot of these sort of bios by people who've done quite well from, let's say, disadvantaged backgrounds, and they all sort of becomes a traditional rags to riches story.
Yeah.
He sort of fights quite hard against that idea of his own exceptionalism. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I read that a while back, actually. I think maybe at least a year ago. I remember really enjoying it. And you're right, there's bits where you're like, oh, really, that happened? Or, oh. And I think he's got an interesting position, isn't he? Because he's got this sort of Scottish element to his family as well, which gives him a kind of maybe a more United Kingdom perspective on stuff than someone who's just grew up in the South might have.
Yeah, there's a good bit I just listened to where meeting his Scottish grandparents and getting the sense that they definitely hated the English more than they hated anyone who was non-white. And I thought that was quite an interesting observation. Yeah. Whether it's true or not, I don't know. But,
well, I mean, it's the sense he gets, I suppose, so that's subjective anyway. But yeah, no. So listening to it, like, I want to go back to why you didn't think it was for you, audiobooks. I mean, I'm kind of the same. Like, I've come around to them recently as well, but I think it was more I didn't understand the point of them.
I think maybe that's it. Yeah, because actually audiobooks they're not a new invention at all. They've been around forever, but they've in this sort of easily consumable way. They're more. I don't know. I suppose I was always a bit of a book purist, I guess, in the kind of physical book form. That's still what I think of as a book. So I suppose I thought audiobooks were imposters in some way. I don't know.
It's an interesting experience, though, isn't it? Because the when you read, I tend to like silence more or less when I read. I can read on the bus and stuff like that, and shield things out. But with audiobooks, it's the opposite. You're inviting noise into your head, you know, and I think that's, for me, like one of the main differences between the two formats, as it were.
Yeah.
One is kind of your voice, and the other is someone else's voice.
Yeah, I'd agree. And
when you read, you tend to read in your own voice in a way, right? You know, so.
Absolutely, and I quite like this one though, because it is the author reading it to you. He's the narrator, which kind of makes sense, because if he's got the skills to do that, so that works for me. I've tried it with fiction; it doesn't work as well. I prefer it for non-fiction books. That's where audio really works for me.
Right, because it's more like a radio show, or
like a 10-hour sort of podcast, which is good.
Yeah, that's funny.
What about you? What are you reading?
Well, funnily enough, I've been listening to an audiobook as well. I don't know, sometimes I just have periods where I just can't, my brain doesn't want to read. It just can't do it. I've been reading some other Percival Everett books, actually, but that's on my Kindle. But I've been listening to a book called Psychological, with the hyphen between the O and the L, obviously. And it's by a guy called Dean Burnett, who's a neuroscientist, neurologist. And it's essentially him writing kind of about the logic of mental health and the sort of science behind it, rather than what you might find in your more sort of therapist-y or psychotherapist-y type books, where there isn't so much of a kind of strictly science aspect to it, if you know what I mean. So it's like it's more about like thinking and stuff like that. He's talking about it in terms of synapses and chemicals and all that sort of stuff. And it's funny, like, the audiobook thing is difficult because when you get, if you're reading a book and you get a bit bored by it, or you're in a stodgy passage, you can sort of skim read.
Yeah.
I'm taking it away. Now here's a bit that's more interesting. You can't really do that with an audiobook. Like, I didn't find like I could fast forward. There were parts where I was like, yeah, okay, I know this sort of stuff. Should I skip it? I wouldn't know where to skip to.
Yeah, you'd have to know, wouldn't you, to which bit. So I suppose you can just zone out, can't you?
Yeah, I guess. Yeah.
That's the equivalent, isn't it? Stop listening for a bit.
Yeah, no, that's true, actually. Anyway, right, so that's our two things. And I can't show either of mine, but for the listener, there we are: Psychological and Telephone by Percival Everett. So let's just talk about the ecosystem.
Yeah, I was going to ask you a question about that. So, because this was put to Twitter, wasn't it? What should we talk about? And actually, self-publishing just pipped this, didn't it? But
yeah,
I think you came up with this topic. But what do you mean by the ecosystem exactly? What are we talking about?
Like several things, I think. So, when we talk about publishing, it's we talk about publishing as publishers. We talk about producing books.
Yeah.
Written by someone, edited by someone, publicized, marketed by someone, sold by someone, read by someone. Like, there's this kind of very obvious linear route the book takes. And that's publishing for me. That's like, we print and you sell books. That's publishing.
Yeah.
But the publishing, I suppose I don't want to call it industry, but the ecosystem for me is the stuff that's around and outside that. This sort of the moons that orbit the publishing planet are not necessarily things that produce books. They're not what I'm talking about. There's several varieties of things, but you've got things like magazines, like
definitely.
Ambit, or journals like N+1, or like big ones like Paris Review, or like more kind of artsy ones like the White Review. You've got online spaces, online magazines, 3M magazine, minor literatures, that sort of stuff, where there's lots of writing occurring. There's editing occurring, there's commissioning occurring, but it's not books. And then you've also got places where writers develop their skills. So you have writing workshops, you've got organizations like Spread the Word, who help develop and incubate writers into becoming better at being writers, or like better expressing themselves, or finding different ways. You got
I think
the
they call that
Avon,
honing your craft, don't they?
honing your craft. Yeah, you got the Avon retreat things that people go on.
Yeah, I mean, Arvon's a huge organisation, isn't it, where people can go on kind of writing retreats and writing courses. And I've done a little bit of work for Arvon for kind of writers at the beginning of their career.
It would be great if you signed up for Avon instead by accident, and you thought you were just going to go and sell makeup door to door. But anyway, so there's all that, and then there's everything else, like who organises live events. People who might not be in the publishing world, as I've termed it originally, people who produce books, just readers, fans, people who set up live events to listen to writers read out loud, and and it's like all this stuff going on that supports the main thrust of the publishing industry. So I think it's all that stuff I wanted to sort of explore, really. Its value, its effect.
And I suppose an interesting question would be: does a writer, an aspiring writer, do they need to engage with all of these things in order to get published? Maybe that's a question we should try and answer.
In order to get published, I think it depends where they're coming from. Yeah. Like if they've got a mate at a publishing house, I don't think they need to do any of that stuff to get published. They just send it to their mate at a publishing house. But or if they know some agents or whatever, like if a lot of that stuff, the more formulaic or traditional routes to publishing, which are traditionally occupied by middle and upper middle class people from various posh universities and stuff like that, I think that they don't necessarily need to do that in any particular way. But there is a case to be made that the honing of your craft will get you more likely to be published.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, that's interesting what you say about the class issue. So we're suggesting that for people who are brought up with an awareness of the existing kind of route to publication, they might not engage with some of these things in the same way. But I suppose you might get involved with like the university magazines or whatever that you go to, and literary events. I think you still have an awareness of that kind of ecosystem. So what are we talking about? I suppose we're talking a little bit more about, I suppose from our own experience, the kind of literary scenes, various literary scenes in London, which some of them seem to be a bit more, or seemed to have been a bit more autonomous or operating not necessarily in direct engagement with that kind of mainstream literary thing, which can be a very beneficial thing. So I mean, we're kind of good friends with the people who run like 3am you mentioned, or Minor Literatures, or Open Pen, of course, who still run a free fiction magazine and do lots of live events. So, I mean, what's the value in those?
Well, I mean,
scene?
I think
is scene the right term for it?
I think scene might be the right term. I think it's about community. It's about expression, and some people who write for Open Pen might not actually want to have a book published by a mainstream publisher. They might just be quite happy knocking out some short stories every now and then being published in various places, but not really have any actual kind of ambitions and massive desire to be like, I want to have my book published by Vintage. You know what I mean? Like there's not everyone who writes wants to be a writer. They just like the act of writing, and they like getting their stories out there and stuff like that. It's And I think the value of that community aspect of it, or scene, if we want to call it, is that it gives space for that. The traditional publishing house does not give space for you just to sort of express yourself every now and then in a short story. You have to write a novel, essentially, right? Like, to be in that game, you have to more or less have written a novel, or an entire short story book.
But you could do both, couldn't you? Presumably, you can be a published writer, and you can still be operating in I suppose that sort of short story world. These scenes that sort of orbit it do seem to focus almost entirely on short fiction or poetry, and I suppose the reason is they're easy to deliver live, aren't they?
Yeah, I think so, because I think the live element is also key to the community aspect of it. Of all community-based activities, on the whole, are about connection with other people. meeting other people, like being in the presence of other people. So I think the live element of it is really crucial. And I think a lot of people like that. They like to be part of a gang or a group, and that's not a disparaging remark. I'm positive about that stuff. I think being part of a group or something feels really nice. You feel like you've got like a set of kind of, if not people who agree with you, people who have a similar set of values. You know,
and are interested in the same sort of things. You don't have
exactly.
to don't have to explain your interests to people when you're in those
No,
kind of. That's quite always a nice thing, I think.
but also, like if we do take Open Pen or 3M as examples, they do also act as a kind of feeder school to the rest of the publishing industry. You know, some people will get their first story published in Open Pen, and then 5 years later, perhaps, have written so many stories based on the confidence they gained from that initial show of support and faith, that they have a book out, that they've got an agent. You know, like there's somewhere, a lot of the time, a lot of writers who aren't automatically aware of how publishing works will find out who to send things to. And then there are people like Sean or Andrew Gallix or Fernando, Tom Quayle, whatever, who are saying, yeah, okay, I'll give you a shot. That sounds quite good. You know, you don't get that at a major publishing house, or an agent doesn't look at one story and goes, yeah, I'll give you a shot for a whole book. It just tends to not happen, right?
Yeah, I mean, that would be very, very, such a vanishingly small occurrence. I think it happened to, I don't know, Kristen Rupenian for the cat person story, but it almost never happens. I think you're right. And I think actually for Influx, I was just thinking about this. That's happened. An upcoming book we're not announcing till September when we announce our new list. But that kind of came through that system, didn't it? A writer who I think was early published by Open Pen went on to have a book based on that, and that kind of caught my attention at least. But I think because we have the, I suppose, benefit of London based, that can go to a lot of the London events. Although to be honest, there's millions of them that I don't go to. There probably is millions because you could be at a literary event every single night, probably two in London.
If you wanted to be, yeah.
Well, not during coronavirus, of course, but any other time. Where did I get to with that thought? But yeah, then you do meet people, but you also sort of take note. So if it's a publication and you think, oh, they've had some hits, as it were, or I like what they're doing, you'll go along and you say, oh, I really like this person's work, and you might start up that kind of conversation, or just, it's a good way, I think, for writers to get on other writers and other editors on their radar.
Yeah, definitely, and I think for writers themselves, they're going to feel less alone as well. Like, writing is a lonely pursuit, right? If you can go out to a live event and knock about with some other writers who you might have read their work, or they might have read your work, or whatever, you're going to feel less like you're going mad on your own on the page. You know, I think that's a really integral part of it, and it isn't. I want to emphasize that, yes, like what we're talking about is also the kind of the feeder school thing of like nurturing talent to the point where it can then be picked up by something bigger. But that isn't the fundamental motivation for those magazines existing, you know. And I think that's what's really key to it, is the motivation for, and you know, you can say this about when you worked at Ambit, or I can say it about like doing Lost Smith magazine and stuff like that. You know, the motivation is not to help writers become novelists or whatever. It's to just create something new, to have something out there that's new, I think. Like, and I don't know what it was like at Ambit for you, but in terms of like that Ambit scene, that's been going for a very, very long time.
It has,
and it has its core audience and stuff like that. But you know, some people might look at Ambit and think, oh, it's a bit intimidating, or it's a bit establishment, but I don't think it is, in a way.
I don't think it is. I mean, I think when I started off there as a kind of intern, basically many years ago, and then ended up becoming one of the fiction editors there for a while. I was there through a kind of interesting period where the original editor, Martin Bax, who had started it in 1959,
Amazing.
retired from doing Ambit. How long ago was that? Maybe 5-6 years ago.
Mm.
So he did it for a long time, and then it moved to Bryony Bax, who was related to him through marriage, and so they had a kind of big reshift there. But I don't know, in terms of it being intimidating and the system, no, I don't think so. I just think because it was so well established, its hit rate for publication was less than 1%, which is quite common for those kind of, I imagine it's probably true of like the White Review and those kind of magazines as well. So I think that's what maybe made it intimidating. I just think the quality of the work being produced was very, very high. But the idea that it was not putting out new stuff I think it was a complete fallacy. That was part of the fun of it, of finding this new work, you know.
Yeah.
And because so many people submitted to Ambit, there was always good new stuff coming in because it had a kind of prestige, but it obviously had to build that up in the 60s and 70s to get to that point and then maintain a kind of level of quality.
Yeah, well, I think that's what I'm trying to get at is what you're saying there is it was exciting to get this new work.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's where the motivation is, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm reading something new I've never read before. This is great. I'd quite like to publish this and know that other people get to read it. Like, you're not sitting there thinking, right, well, if I publish this means that writer will then in 5 years' time become X, Y. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's just the work itself you want to get out.
Yeah, I think I don't want to speak for magazine editors, but I don't think the thought process would be beyond, this is a brilliant piece of work, we want it in our magazine and get it out there for people to read.
Right, and the interesting thing about that is the converse experience of the writer may be something else, where they're like, well, if I get it in Ambit and then I start building my profile, eventually I can get an agent. You know, I think writers see the magazines as stepping stones in a way the magazines don't see themselves as stepping stones.
I think the magazine editors are aware of it. It's just like you said, that's not why they're doing it. They're not doing it to help out necessarily like kind of big publishers find people. It's just, it's an interesting question, that, isn't it? I mean, would you run a literary magazine as an editor? I mean, I like the idea, but it just seems absolutely knackering to do it.
I mean, publishing books is tiring enough, to be honest.
Tiring enough, isn't it?
I think it requires a certain level of probably patience and effort that maybe I can't speak for all these magazines or whatever, but like we turn a profit as a publishing house. Like we've discussed in our money episode, it's not enough for us to live on our wages full time or whatever, but it's at least we're sitting there generating money, winning a couple of prizes, blah blah blah. Right? There's stuff. There's other remunerations, let's say. Now, if you're running a free magazine, or you're running an online magazine that doesn't make any money, there's a real, you've got to be really committed to the cause of that magazine, I think.
And you're doing it for the work itself. I think, strangely, I think there's probably more of a, I'm probably going to flatter some people here, probably more of a purity and in the kind of devotion to the work itself, because I suppose you're almost taking away that kind of profit motive, aren't you?
Yeah.
So it's just about the quality, and then so these lunatics are just doing it out of the sheer love of putting good new artistic endeavours into the world. What is wrong with them, mate?
But I think so, because ultimately, that is the case, and I think before we kind of took publishing more seriously, I think that's what we were doing with a couple of our only books.
I think so. Yeah,
I think that's probably what we were doing. I think it requires a youthful energy. I'm not necessarily sure that you can do it past the age of 40, unless you can just pass on unless you become like the editor up here who doesn't really do much and everyone else does stuff below you. I think it requires youthful energy, and it requires a sort of a desire to find the new stuff. It's very easy, I think. It would be very easy, I think, to run a magazine where you have some money, you can pay writers decently, and you just populate it. I think I'm going to probably say like a bit like Granta, bit like the Paris Review, you just populate with writers who are already well known, and it just sells off the back of the fact that it's got Zadie Smith, Salman Rushdie, and John Updike writing in it. You know.
See, it never appealed to me that in the same way. I always kind of wanted stuff by new writers. It is that kind of sense that the good literary magazines, both print and online, there should be a bit of trust that they're kind of curating that very fashionable word, curating the kind of great new work being produced. Maybe, and you might have work by some established writers, but if it was only a vehicle for those, I do struggle not to see what the point is, but it doesn't really appeal to me, I must say.
No, I think I agree, and that's what I mean by the ecosystem. I think something like the Paris Review is actually inside the publishing industry. Mm-hmm. It's not an orbiting moon. It's like it's certainly within the whole thing.
Well, of course, and Granta magazine and Granta, the publisher, you'd be hard pressed to pull those apart, really. I don't know. Sorry, just to carry on. I was going to say, one thing I find a bit not saddening on a personal level is because I've been so busy running Influx and reading submissions that I don't get as much time as I used to have to read the kind of online journals, all the literary journals. So I've got like huge stacks of magazines I subscribe to that I haven't read for 6 months, but I'm glad to know they're there. Do you know what I mean? And I'd like to make more time to do that, because we've said this before, it is where you're going to find a lot of the kind of vanguard of what's happening is going to be in these places.
Yeah, and I think also the benefit, particularly of the online version, is you can be absolutely up to date, contemporary. You can respond to things that have happened in the last month, or you can write a story about something that's happened to you. You can't do that with novels that are published by traditional publishing houses. It takes 2 years, even once you've completed it, mostly for the book to come out. So I think the strength of these things is in their immediacy to respond, and their kind of hyper contemporariness. So that for me is like, that's what I love about. I think I love about London and the London literature scene is it is super up to date. I mean, I can't speak for other regional ones, but I think it's one of those things that you realise when you kind of get involved in it, or you find out what's going on, that there's a whole wealth of it. Like you say, you can go to something once every night if you want to. That's a rich culture.
It is, and I wanted to ask something kind of related to these sort of things. I mean, we have to talk about social media and the role of these things now, right? I mean, how do you think it's more beneficial to be going to, I suppose, the live events and getting involved in these communities in the physical realm, or what's the benefits of social media in this?
Benefit to who?
I suppose to the writer. We're talking about the benefit to the writer here, really, aren't we? Or the aspiring writer.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard, isn't it? There's a couple of caveats you need to put in that, if the events are not disabled access, hard to get to. So, we're talking about people who are able to get to these events to start with, whether they're beneficial, and whether they're welcoming and all that sort of stuff. But I'm old school. I like being in places with people. I like talking to people. I like being part of something that's physical. And also, I think you get to meet people a little bit more naturally and develop relationships a little bit more naturally. But I do appreciate it's hard for some people to be that outgoing or just turn up to something and be like, oh, hey guys, can I join in? Like, that's hard for some people. That's fine. But
I was going to say that there's a flip side then, isn't there, to the, let's say, scene aspect of these things. So I think it would always be worth people not being mindful of not becoming too insular, because writers are nervous people as it is, and you don't want to be unwelcoming. I can remember many years ago, my friend was a spoken word performer. Some of those nights, I think it's good in a way. You get the sense that everyone knows each other and are supporting each other. but I always wondered this could tip into clickiness. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the avoidance of cliqueiness is key to all of this, because otherwise you're just replicating the same elitism that is inaccessible to most people anyway, which makes literature an elitist form. On the other hand, the kind of absolute free for all of the online stuff is not. It's so opposite to that. It's almost has the same damaging effect in a way of like, obviously with my experience of that sort of online stuff definitely comes from the Lost Lit thing that I started with Aki Schiltz, and we started this hashtag for fun to have like a writing session every month, and it being Twitter, it was obviously completely open, which was the point of it. And then we developed an online magazine off the back of that. But after 4 years, I was really tired of it, and
Why?
It just, I think because, and this is going to be disrespectful to the people joining in on the hashtag and writing and stuff like that. When something's open for everyone, and there's no critique or development, the writing itself suffers. And I think when you're perhaps in a less wide open thing, there's more opportunity and more trust in your fellow community members to critique your work and for you to learn and develop. And I think, but I think when it's absolutely no holds barred, it's either the critique is then seen as an attack because you don't know who it is and they're just saying, well, this is shit, mate, or whatever, or it's so soft it doesn't have an effect in which that you develop your writing from it.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've talked about this in earlier episodes, but I think you're correct there that social media is particularly bad for any kind of nuanced critique of anything. It either goes to like almost like sort of hagiography or kind of mass praise or just mass condemnation, and it's not particularly helpful in that sense. And I think it can really distort things, can't it?
On the other hand, the Lost Lit stuff, I'm quite proud of what we did for a while, and a lot of people developed a lot of work out of it, and I think it was a, what's the right word, a decent jumping off point for people just to go, oh yeah, Wednesday night, oh yeah, okay, I'll write some stuff, like I'll write some tweets down and whatever. And what worked about it was it's limited. It actually worked, I think, better when it was 140 characters.
Yeah.
Than when Twitter changed to 280, because the pithiness was what's so good about it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. But what you mentioned there is essentially a writing prompt where you've got your theme, it's Lost Lit, and at one point it's 140 characters, which I think that kind of leads on to the role of some of the other organisations you mentioned, people perhaps running writing workshops. You mentioned, who did you mention? Spread the Word?
Yeah.
So, I mean, do you want to explain what Spread the Word?
Yeah, we've both worked for Spread the Word. So they're I don't know what they call themselves. I call them like an incubator for literary talent. But they're essentially a charity which helps writers develop their craft and develop their skills and gives them support, and also can help them introduce them to agents, to other parts of the publishing industry. Where I've done stuff with them is with run non-fiction critical feedback groups where it's me and 6 writers they've selected, and we spend 3 months looking at each other's work and giving critical feedback in the way that you can't do online. You're doing it in person, and everyone. It's a little bit like you might get on an MA program or something like that. And I think it really, really helps the authors look at what they're writing and how they're writing it. I know there's lots of other stuff Spread the Word do, but I think that there's a point. The point to Spread the Word is they're not a publisher. They're not interested in publishing. They're not even producing a magazine, but they're still helping writers. And that's what's interesting about them.
I suppose they're interested in publishing, but they are kind of definitely facilitators, and I think kind of similar groups exist around the country, aren't they? But Spread the Word is the one that focuses on London
Yeah,
writers.
New Writing North, and I think they perform a very similar function. Yeah,
but I think these kind of organisations are really crucial because they aim to be very inclusive and quite affordable when they do charge for stuff. I think they do quite a few. I think they do a lot of free events. I'm trying to think. They do short story competitions, of course, don't they? And they do. Didn't they have a kind of memoir non-fiction competition?
Yeah, London Writers Award. Yeah,
London Writers Award. I've sat on panels. I remember doing one with me representing Influx, and there was Crystal from Own It and Claire from Three of Cups talking to audiences just about, I suppose, independent publishing, which I like the fact that Spread the Word are essentially facilitating this. So writers who maybe don't know everything that we know do have a space to go to find out about this stuff. If they don't know about this podcast, they can go to a Spread the Word
yeah.
and learn the tricks. And then I suppose that might even be the stage before you've learned about the literary magazines or the literary events, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's having the support of a kind of what you might say like a legitimate organisation like Spread the Word. I think if they get behind you, I think that can boost your confidence as a writer.
Yeah.
And a lot of writing is about confidence, right? And a lot of it is about someone validating you and saying, "Yeah, it's pretty good actually. You've got some talent." Because most people don't know if they've got the talent. Most people don't understand. If you don't understand what you're trying to do, you can't make it better.
Yeah.
And I think the organisations, like you say, like Spread the Word, I think particularly are very good at that. There are, of course, other things around. I mean, I love Spread the Word. I want to barely a bad word said about them, but there are also other spaces like Arvon, which I don't have an experience of, but I know they're probably more expensive to go on. I imagine. I don't know.
Yeah, and it's a nationwide thing, but I think they offer quite intensive courses for people, and they mentor people who they've chosen to sort of be their mentees. Is that the word? Like I said, I was supposed to do a thing with them in the flesh. We did it over Zoom in the end, kind of giving feedback to people on the Arvon courses, their work, and had like one-to-one discussions, just kind of talking about what we're talking about now, talking about the ecosystem and sort of how it works, and how to progress in the way they wanted to progress.
And the Arvon, how do you get selected to be on an Arvon course?
I don't know, to be honest.
Is it done on work? Do they read your work and then go, yeah, okay, you can come on the course? Or
I really don't know. Okay. Sorry.
That would be interesting to me. Is like where, and I think the same with TLC, the literary consultancy, which Aki aforementioned is the director of. They take manuscript assessments. Or they do manuscript assessments, so people who are not quite sure about what they're writing can send stuff in, and they do mentorships as well.
But you have to pay for the assessments, right?
I think so. They have some Arts Council stuff where it's free for marginalised people, marginalised writers. And my question is always with these things is like, do you? And it's the same with with your Readsy stuff as well, right? That we've mentioned before. Is if you see the work and you're like, it's just some rescuable, like, where do you draw the line between saying, yeah, we want to help you because we want to encourage you to write because lots of people should be encouraged to write, or you just say, yeah, I mean, there's no hope for you, mate.
I don't think I'd ever say no hope, but I don't see the value of lying to people. If you say this needs heavy revisions, or you really need to start from the ground up, and all those kind of sayings, I mean, that would be the ethical thing to do, right?
Because essentially, like, if you submit something to a magazine and they just say no, that's just them saying it's not good enough. They don't have, you know what I mean? It's a very blunt and final way of saying we're not going to take this piece of work. Yeah. But with the editorial services and that kind of bit of the orbiting of the ecosystem, you don't want to just say no, because actually you're trying to encourage them to get better. But it must be quite delicate. I think it's a delicate balance.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I've never really done many editorial assessments. It's more just been doing the actual editing. The assessment presumably is you read the manuscript and then you give fairly detailed feedback, but you're not
Yeah,
editing
but
it.
you
Is that
don't. Yeah,
right?
you don't edit it. So when I've done them for
Mm.
the literary consultancy, I'll break it down and be like, what I liked about the
Hmm.
plot, what I didn't like, what I didn't think like about the plot, what I liked about the characters, what I didn't think like about the characters, what I liked about the themes, what I didn't like about the themes. I won't actually go through it and say this should change, that should go here. You know, there's none of
Yeah,
that
so
sort of.
it's very big picture.
Yeah, very big
Yeah.
picture. Yeah, yeah. Which is useful, I think. But um, yeah, I've only ever seen ones or been sent ones that are kind of pretty well accomplished already. So
That's
maybe there's a
interesting.
screening process that the TLC do. I don't know, but they also run events, and you know, so and they're not a publisher either. You know, that's what's interesting, isn't it? There's lots of people dealing with lots of writers, and often dealing with writers who are unpublished, which is different to what we're often dealing with. Because even though we might take like debut novels and things like that, a
Mm.
lot of our writers will have had a story published somewhere, or they've already got to that point where they've been published a couple
Absolutely,
of
yeah.
times. You know, so we're at a different stage at Influx to a lot of these other
Yeah, I think so,
organizations.
but that's because because we're a publisher,
Mm.
but we're very aware of the stuff that they're doing, and like you said, we've done events and work for them as ourselves as Influx,
Yeah.
so it's definitely, yeah, you can definitely see the kind of interconnectedness of all of it there.
Mm.
Um, I don't know how it works with larger publishers, but I think they do lots of events with them, and I think people come in to give talks and agents explain how it all works. Yeah.
I think it
What
was.
else?
Well, my question would be for you actually. It'd be without the if we're using the ecosystem to mean like the magazines and the organizations and stuff like that, um, putting aside live events and stuff like that for now, do you think you would be where you are now without them?
No, is my short answer, but I will elaborate on this. I don't think so, because I think my whole awareness of, much like we said in the self-publishing episode where we talked a bit about radical publishing and
Yeah,
going to radical book fairs and anarchist book fairs and all those things, and finding all those sort of bits and bobs. I think having a natural interest in it and attending certain events and meeting people and chatting people greatly kind of expanded my awareness of everything that was going on. And then you could find this stuff on social media, and then you find more connections, and you slowly sort of map out in your own head of like all the connections between things and sort of how it was going on. Because again, most of that information on the sort of route to publication, I don't feel was particularly clear
mm.
10, 15 years ago. Um, Maybe it was, and I wasn't looking in the right places, but I wasn't really sure of what it was. And so this stuff genuinely helped me, have an awareness of, I suppose, the industry and how it all fits together. But it definitely helps you as a writer as well, because you're speaking with other people who are interested in the same stuff, like I said, and you're watching readings and you're reading new stuff, and that can only ever help you as someone who's trying to kind of produce creative work. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. Yeah, I think from. I mean, I would also say no. I don't think I'd be where I am without that stuff. But I think it's from my perspective, it's more because I wouldn't have felt like I belonged anywhere. You know, like I'd just be like, well, how do I even get into this publishing castle thing? You know, like to be to for those magazines and those periodicals and journals and all sorts of other stuff to be so open to new
Yeah.
people makes it feel like you're like, oh, actually, I can be in this space, I'm legitimately allowed in this space, and
Hmm.
then you begin to see, oh, that fits in here. That's how that's that, you know. But also, it's quite inspiring. People are just doing it because they love doing it, and that's what inspired, I think, us to do Influx in the first place, right? It was that
Absolutely.
you can just do it. You know, and so you know, when we talk about like those DIY radical magazines and stuff, we might not be talking about things that are politically radical. We might be talking about journals like Structo, who
Yes.
just DIY, but they're not like putting out super queer, lefty, hardcore, like, radical literature.
I think this is true. I think we first met Ewan, who does Structo magazine and now Structo Press. I think first met him at one of these sort of DIY publishing fairs, maybe even before Influx. I think you might have been doing Stalking Elk, and I think Structo was still like a newspaper. So there would be a good example of someone still in contact now, doing great work, meeting in these kind of spaces. So I think there's a fantastic example of why it's good to get involved, essentially, and be out there in these spaces, because you open yourselves up to, I suppose, chances happening. Do you know, if that makes sense?
Yeah, well, we've said this before, haven't we? That you've got to be in the space. You've got to be there for the luck to occur.
So luck and chance is always a part of life, I think. But I think you have to put yourself in the spaces where certain things can happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to wrap it up now, but I do want to ask you to recommend or sort of list some of your favourite sort of those journal stroke publication things to give anybody who's listening an indication of where to go that they might not know about.
Yeah, I will do that. So before we start that, I'd say if anyone's looking for like lists of this stuff, we've mentioned before, Short Stops has a really good list of literary journals. And I was just looking beforehand, Neon magazine, I think they've just updated it in April this year. They have a really excellent list of online and print journals in the UK who publish short stories and poetry. What would my favourites be? We've mentioned a few of them. I'm a big fan of Ambit still. I think Ambit, just as a physical object, is pretty amazing. I love it. It's a nice mixture of poetry, short fiction, and art, and it's just got such a kind of prestigious history to it. With its days of associated with J.G. Ballard and all that. It's great. I think it's a really important, long-running kind of British institution. I like it in that sense. Structo, aforementioned Structo, again, a really great looking as well, sort of literary journal, short fiction, poetry again, and do they do photography? I think they do. I'm always impressed with Open Pen. I think some of the writers who've come out of the Open Pen school, who are now being published in novelette form, has been very impressive. As much as I hate to say that to Sean, who started it, I've been impressed with their output very much. And who else? I always thought the Anthology series, that I think both you and I have had stories in, run by Ashley Stokes. I don't know if it's even still going at the moment, but the Anthology was really good. They were kind of like a yearly, it was more than a magazine, wasn't it? It was like it was almost like a book, but a yearly anthology they put out. I always really enjoyed that. I found lots of writers I read now, I'd actually first read, I think, in some of the anthologies. What about you? What would your choices be?
I do like the White Review.
I
think the White Review is really good. It can veer into the sort of experimentalist, vanguard bits where I'm just like, I have no idea what's going on. But I do like it. I think the White Review Short Story Prize is the caliber of that is sometimes quite unbelievable. I quite like Lonely Crowd. I think that's a good one.
Lonely Crowd is good, from Wales.
I think that they produce some really interesting stuff. I'm trying to think who else I kind of knock about with. It's been a while actually since I've really got like subscribed to a particular Gorse. I think Gorse. I think it might be folding soon, but Gorse was also up there. In terms of online, like I think the ones we mentioned are only 3am, Minor Literatures. Are kind of two of the best in terms, because they don't just have short stories. They've got essays, they've got writing about literature, they've got interviews. So that's kind of your more kind of literary magazine style thing, which I really like. And 3M has just got an insane backlist, if you want to call it that. Like 20 years of publishing. It's quite amazing what they've managed to produce, I think.
I still think they have the best sort of slogan out of anyone as well, which was what was it? Whatever it is, we're against it. I love that.
Yeah, it's really funny. Yeah.
Still love that.
I think that's probably it in terms of what I look at. But yeah, this Neon magazine, like I say, has got this long, massive list for people to look at. And
Yes, but this is the thing for me. I find there's always new stuff popping up, which is great to see. I always need to kind of refresh myself of what's going on, because these things don't stay the same, which is good. And I think it's always good that people are starting their new news on online zines and journals all the time.
Yeah. So what we're saying is keep it going.
Keep it going, yeah.
All right. So we can then start nabbing all the authors and get success out of them.
Yeah, exactly that.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's it until next week. Thanks. See you then.
All right, thanks, bye.